The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, the midterm mandate on economic populism, why we need a progressive mandate on foreign policy, and after a judge rules ACA unconstitutional, what's next? Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Adam Green is an advocate for progressive change at the local, state, and national levels. He says if there is one lesson to learn from the midterms, it's that economic populism is the new mainstream. And we say hello to Adam Green, co-founder of the Progressive Change Campaign Committee. Adam Green, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Hello, good to be here.
Well, and our pleasure to have you with us. You recently wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post titled, "The Midterms Prove It. Progressives' Ideas Are Now Mainstream." You begin by writing that the center of gravity in the Democratic Party is shifting to economic populism. What is some of the evidence of the shift?
Yeah, so I wrote that right after the 2018 election, after the crack team at the Progressive Change Institute spent about a month doing a content analysis of how every single incoming House Democrat actually campaigned on the issues. And what we found is that 65% of incoming House congressional freshmen campaigned on some version of Medicare for all or expanding Social Security benefits. About 80% campaigned against Big Pharma, promising to bring down the cost of prescription drugs. And about 82% campaigned against corporate money in politics, some version of campaign finance reform, calling it corporate money. That is a sea change from where we were just several years ago. Really, before the Wall Street collapse, it was almost unheard of to use the words income inequality or to have any variation of challenging corporate power. And, Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street, jump-started that conversation. Elizabeth Warren's rise helped catapult ideas like Glass-Steagall and other Wall Street reforms into the mainstream. And some of the stats that I just mentioned are kind of the end result of where we are now as we enter a new Congress and a really exciting 2020 election year.
You also write that nothing better expresses the change than a shifting consensus on Social Security. So what are you seeing?
Yeah, it's fascinating. Barack Obama was a fantastic president on many fronts. I'm not sure that the people in the Barack Obama White House ever really knew how much time and energy by progressives was wasted having to push back against a Democratic White House that put cuts to Social Security on the table when they were thinking about a quote-unquote grand bargain with Republicans that would basically allow for some tax increases on the rich in exchange for cutting Social Security benefits. Usually in a compromise, each side has the upper hand on some issue. In that case, the Republican position of cutting Social Security was devastatingly unpopular, and the Republican position of keeping tax rates low on the super rich was devastatingly unpopular. So there was no need for a compromise on that. But so many progressive groups organized millions of members to push back. And at one point, we were at around a table with about a dozen other groups and basically proposed a strategy shift to expanding Social Security benefits. Because if the entire scope of debate was, do we make cuts or do we do nothing, the most progressives would ever get is nothing. And it was, a several-year strategy where one by one, various senators started coming on the record for expanding benefits. Elizabeth Warren pulled a rabbit out of a hat and got Joe Manchin to co-sponsor a resolution with her calling for expanded benefits. It got a 3 a.m. vote in early 2015, and literally overnight, we went from having 7 to 42 Democratic senators on the record for expanding benefits. That led directly to the 2016 campaign, where, unlike just a few years before, Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders had a robust debate about how much to expand Social Security benefits, not whether we should, and certainly not whether we should make cuts. And today, Connor Lamb, who won a special election, this past year in a 20-point Trump district and campaigned actively against cuts to Social Security benefits, as of now, he is the new co-chair of the Expand Social Security Caucus in the House, along with Elizabeth Warren and others. So again, just been a sea change, and that's one representative sample on that issue, right alongside the rise of Medicare for All, the rise of a Green New Deal, so many other policies that represent a sea change and a shift in the center of gravity within the Democratic Party and the general electorate as a whole.
Now, of course, your organization advocates strongly for Social Security expansion, and you note that it is popular with voters, both Republicans and Democrats. What would it take politically for this to actually happen, though?
Yeah, and just to be clear on that, we've done polling of general election voters, and expanding Social Security benefits is wildly popular. 70% of the people support it, compared to only 15% opposing, and about 10 or 15% undecided. The majority of Republican voters support it. So what does it take to get it into law? That's a great question. What we notice is a wonderful boomerang effect between momentum on the legislative side of things and momentum on the campaign trail. So 2014 was the first cycle that any Democrats actually ran on expanding Social Security benefits in primaries and won, allowing Democratic primary voters to weigh in. 2016 was the first cycle that lots of Democrats ran on expanding Social Security benefits in the general election. And, this cycle in 2018, we saw even more candidates do so, with Anna Eleanor Roosevelt, the granddaughter of FDR, sending an email to our national membership at boldprogressives.org, highlighting about 40 candidates who were actively running for House on expanding Social Security benefits. And after we prove that it's a winning political concept on the campaign trail, it's all about legislative momentum in Congress. So right now we have in the House a very popular bill to expand benefits. I think it has about 175 co-sponsors in the last Congress, and we'll hopefully have more and more, approaching the magic number of 218 in the House this Congress. Once we show that we have our ducks in a row, once we show that the votes are there, we need one final mandate on the campaign trail, and that's what 2020 is all about. So we expect people like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and others to be active, vocal champions for expanding Social Security and Medicare for All and challenging corporate power in other respects, as well as fighting for racial justice and social justice. So we have a mandate going into the year 2021, which could be the next big progressive governing opportunity, since our challenge on every issue is to get our ducks in a row, show the political will, show that the votes are there, so that we can do big things at that point.
I'm kind of surprised, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like this is taking a long time. I know it hasn't been discussed that long, but it seems like something like Social Security expansion, with its popularity amongst all parties, and more people in Congress behind it, why hasn't this moved along a little more quickly?
Well, it's funny you say that. I think, most advocates would say, hey, if we can shift the entire national debate from a bad position to a fantastic position in, 5 years, 4 years, that would be considered a best case scenario.
That is a victory. That's true.
I mean, we feel pretty good. I mean, again, the mainstreaming of expand Social Security between 2013 and 2014 and the continued momentum since then has been great. If your real question is why isn't it in law, I mean, a lot of this happened, when Obama was president, but also when we had a Republican Congress. And, the way that I'm increasingly looking at many issues is that there's a floor and a ceiling for where Democrats are. And progressives can, claim victory and judge our own momentum by seeing how both the ceiling and the floor are rising. So again, when 2016, when, it was a huge moment when Hillary Clinton in the primary endorsed expanding Social Security benefits for some and said that she wouldn't cut benefits, while Bernie Sanders also would not cut benefits, but was saying let's expand benefits for all seniors. Well, that's the floor and that's the ceiling, but what a wonderful scope of debate to be having in 2016 compared to a Democratic president working to cut Social Security in 2013, right? So,
sure.
Same thing with Medicare for All. Like just a couple of years ago, we and others were laughed at for even talking about a public option. We were just told, hey, silly progressives, let's just focus on implementing Obamacare. And then once it was implemented, let's just focus on technocratic tweaks to Obamacare. And now, of course, everybody supports any fixes to Obamacare that would improve people's lives. That's a no-brainer, and we'll all be there. But more and more, the floor for debate is a Medicare option that anybody can buy into if they want to, as a competitor to private insurance, to create more competition for the big insurance companies and more choices for consumers. And the ceiling, which is increasingly popular with the public and increasingly mainstream among politicians, is Medicare for all single payer. And what a wonderful place to be in. And again, right now, the time that it all needs to fit into place is 2021 if we have a progressive Democratic president and a Democratic House and Senate. So that's what a strategy has to look like.
I'll work on my patience as much as I possibly can. We're speaking with Adam Green, who's co-founder of the Progressive Change Campaign Committee. And Adam, as an organization committed to economic populism and progressive politics, what are the other issues that you fight for?
Yeah, so I think increasingly there is consensus in progressive world that we need to be thinking about racial justice, social justice, and economic justice all under one big umbrella, where the general theme is being willing to challenge powerful interests on behalf of the less powerful and on behalf of working families. And as you said, we work very closely with Elizabeth Warren, and we do go deep on a lot of economic issues. So Medicare for All is right up there these days as an issue that we are talking about. We were actually highlighted on Meet the Press this past weekend with Chuck Todd asking Chuck Schumer if he agrees with our organization that Medicare for All needs to be a bright North Star in the sky for 2020 voters, showing what Democrats would do with more power. We've been very impressed with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and her catapulting of a Green New Deal into national conversation. That's another issue where there's a floor and a ceiling. And some people will talk about infrastructure from the context of, what might Mitch McConnell and Senate Republicans agree to in the Senate? That's what the House Democratic proposal should be. Sneak preview, that will be something very small bore that will be very ineffectual and create almost no jobs. The Green New Deal, creating tens of millions of jobs, focusing on clean energy, is the ceiling. And there's many good things in between that will create millions of new good-paying jobs, having jobs of the future like high-speed internet for every community, clean energy, having gender equity and racial equity included in the hiring, making sure that we're taking care of communities like Flint, Michigan. Our organization at boldprogressives.org has been working very closely with our friends in Congress and ally organizations to put bold infrastructure jobs proposals on the table. And another one is debt-free college. This is another one where just a few years ago, the ceiling of debate was, can we lower interest rates for students, right? So just assume mountains and mountains of debt, hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. Let's just give them better interest rates. And now there's a growing consensus. And again, it was a sea change when we got Hillary Clinton to endorse this policy while Bernie Sanders was talking about free tuition. There's a consensus that through some combination of more aid to the states to bring down the cost of public colleges and universities, more aid for Pell Grants, which is need-based tuition assistance, possibly some degree of work study, maybe some degree of parental contribution for those in the upper middle class. Through a combination of all these levers, people should be able to graduate on graduation day with no debt, so that they are free to take their dream job. They're free to get married if they want to, have their first home, have their first car, and not have their job taking and decision making in their life dictated by decades of debt. That's great. So all of these things really are working families' agenda. All of these things fit under the category of challenging powerful interests and powerful norms. And it's really great that these ideas are on the rise.
And Adam, as we gear up for the 2020 elections, how can progressive Democrats be more effective in a platform of economic populism?
Yeah, so we need to hold Democratic feet to the fire in addition to fighting back against bad stuff from Republicans. Again, groups like ours, which I would encourage people to join at boldprogressives.org, as well as others, Democracy for America, Color of Change, Move On, others, very much engage the public around elections, but also things that are happening in Congress. Right now, there's a really consequential but often below the radar debate happening about which incoming members will get key committee assignments. Why? That's so wonky. Why does that matter? Well, the House Ways and Means Committee, which tends to be dominated by Republicans and corporate Democrats who understand the levers of power this committee has, is the committee that will determine, do we overturn the Trump tax cuts, which would free up over $1 trillion of money now going to big corporations and the super wealthy in order to fund things like Medicare for all, debt-free college, expanding Social Security benefits, Green New Deal jobs, right? Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is making a bid to be on that committee. Other progressives are as well. Our friend Katie Porter, who is Elizabeth Warren's protege, was one of our top House candidates that we endorsed this cycle and flipped a red district in California. She wrote 2 books with Elizabeth Warren, was a top consumer watchdog for California. She is now making a play to be on the House Financial Services Committee, which regulates the big banks. Wouldn't that be a sea change from people who get funded by the big banks, even though they're Democrats? So fights like that in Congress just have so much impact for what the Democratic agenda is. What is the North Star that we're putting in the sky for voters in advance of 2020? Do voters who want to be inspired feel that both parties are sellout and stay home in 2020, or think, oh, this is what it means to be a Democrat? They are challenging power for me, right? So I would just really encourage people to stay in the loop, be willing to fight back against Republicans, but also be willing to hold Democratic feet to the fire so that we can maximize our gains in 2020 and pass great ideas into law.
Excellent advice. Adam Green, co-founder of the Progressive Change Campaign Committee, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Adam, thank you so much for your time. We look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Thank you so much.
You're quite welcome. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America. Whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, can progressives fix the president's foreign policy nightmare? But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
What did you do in the war, Daddy? I was on the front line stringing bands of concertina wire along the border. Concertina? Were you in the Army band? No, not a concert. Concertina wire is razor wire, very sharp and painful. It keeps people out, or in. What people? Migrants from Central America, thousands of them coming to the USA. Why are they coming here, Daddy? Because they're fleeing gang wars, hunger, rape, and murder back home. They're desperately poor, mostly women and children, seeking safety by walking hundreds of miles to our land of the free. So why the Army, Daddy? Don't we have a border patrol, custom agents, state and local police, National Guard troops? And couldn't a few local contractors handle the wire-stringing job instead of deploying 6,000 active-duty troops and tons of equipment, costing taxpayers about $210 million? Stop making sense. But it doesn't make sense. It doesn't have to if you're President Trump. The congressional elections were coming up, and he needed to scare people into voting for his party, so he used the Army as his political prop. We soldiers know this, but it's not our job to tell the commander-in-chief how to deploy America's fighting forces. So we've spent the whole holiday season down on the border, idly stringing concertina wire. Now, with the election over and no border crisis having occurred, we're being sent out to take down some of the wire. This is Jim Hightower saying, but don't think the Commander-in-Chief is unappreciative of our soldiers' work on his behalf. While he didn't bother to thank the troops he sent to do concertina duty, he did take a moment during his 2-week Thanksgiving getaway at his opulent Mar-a-Lago golf resort to issue best holiday wishes to all the military members deployed around the globe. Afterwards, he told reporters, "Nobody has done more for the military than me."
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. The president's foreign policy agenda is increasingly reckless, with lawmakers on both sides of the aisle clearly unnerved. Our next guest says the time is long overdue for progressives to step up. And we say hello to Eric Lutz. He's a writer whose articles have appeared in many publications, such as The Progressive, The Guardian, The New Republic, and Mike. Eric Lutz, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure to have you with us. We're talking today about one of your most recent articles in The Progressive, titled, "Can Progressive Dems Fix Trump's Nightmarish Foreign Policy?" In it, you note that many of the rising stars in progressive politics, such as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, have not been very vocal with their foreign policy platforms. Why would that be the case?
Yeah, so I think that, first of all, it hasn't been total radio silence on the part of the progressives and Democrats here, right? As a whole, they have obviously not shied away from sharing their reactions to specific Trump blunders on the world stage, whether it's, lobbing schoolyard insults at world leaders on Twitter or like cozying up to Vladimir Putin. And like AOC and other progressives have at least outlined the broad strokes of a foreign policy approach. But I think the big issue here is that global affairs have not been front and center in any of their platforms. I think there's probably a few reasons for that. One is that progressives have not been taken seriously, by and large, by the foreign policy establishment, historically speaking. I think also that much of the progressive energy right now is in the House, which generally has, taken more of a back seat to the Senate on foreign policy matters. And then finally, I just don't know how big of a priority it is for many of the progressives right now, many in the progressive wing and Democrats as a whole in some cases. I don't think they feel quite as comfortable talking about some of these issues. They've taken strong, compelling stances on domestic matters like healthcare and wages, immigration, and all that clearly appealed to voters in the last election. But I think hashing out a foreign policy platform, at least in public, hasn't appeared to be as much of a priority.
Mm-hmm. And you would think that it would be because everything's related. I mean, all of our domestic programs are somehow related to our foreign policy as well, or at least you can certainly draw a line between them. So it seems odd that they wouldn't spend a little bit more on that. You also note that when progressive Democrats do weigh in on foreign affairs, it lays bare a schism between themselves and the Democratic Party foreign policy establishment. So describe that schism, if you would.
Yeah, so I think that there's ways in which the split is not so much between Democrats and Republicans as it is about the foreign policy establishment versus the more populist segments of each party. Many progressives I've spoken to on this issue, they've expressed a lack of confidence in the establishment and are really kind of allergic to that sort of hawkishness and militarism and interventionism that led us to, say, the Iraq War. So what you see from them tends to be pretty populist, pretty non-interventionist, in a way that, like, from a distance, can kind of mirror what Trump was saying on the campaign trail, right? That our resources are being diverted to foreign conflicts abroad at the expense of, Americans here at home, that we need to be less militaristic, that the establishment has been wrong. Of course, the president has his own Trumpian twist on that. A lot of it is quite ignorant, a lot of it quite aggressive, much of it arguably quite self-serving as well. And of course, he hasn't followed through on any of that kind of non-interventionist platform. You see him, intervening all over the world using our military. But what you see from progressives, where they would probably be different from Trump, is not only a focus on non-interventionism, but a greater focus on soft powers and more aggressive diplomacy, as opposed to kind of this brute force and strength that Trump at least tries to project.
You quote Stephen Miles, director of Win Without War at the Center for International Policy, who says there is an opportunity now to heal that schism. Do you think that's likely to happen?
There could be an opportunity for that, right? For a couple of reasons. We're seeing this huge new influx of Democrats, many progressives like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and even people like Bernie Sanders, who have been around for a while and who have long argued for more peaceful solutions, more diplomatic solutions, and less of an interventionist foreign policy, right? So there's new blood in the party, and I think that if there's conversation, that could be a healing opportunity, right? I think another thing here is Trump himself. I kind of see him as the exposed nerve of U.S. foreign policy in some ways, where he's kind of laid bare some of the long-standing issues that have long plagued U.S. foreign policy, just because he's so vulgar and obvious about the way he goes about everything, right? Saudi Arabia is a perfect example of that. Like, for decades, U.S. Leaders have embraced a very problematic regime in Saudi Arabia and have had to look the other way at a lot of atrocities that have been committed by them. Of course, recently with the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, the journalist, Trump just explicitly saying, whether they did it or not, I'm still going to support them. I think that that's tougher to swallow for a lot of Americans when there's not at least the veneer of, however thin, of respectability and of concern there. So I think that some of the baldness with which he's handled some of these foreign policy issues, even when they've been within the tradition of U.S. foreign policy, I think has Americans taking a second look at some of those longstanding policies and wondering if those are really the correct ways that we should be approaching the world.
We're speaking with Eric Lutz, writer whose articles have appeared in many publications, such as The Progressive, The Guardian, New Republic, and Mike. Eric, one progressive Democrat who has not been shy on foreign policy is California's Ro Khanna. How does he stand out?
Yeah, so Ro Khanna, as you mentioned, he's a California Democrat. He's a progressive on the Armed Services Committee there in the House. And he is one progressive who has been notably outspoken on these issues, particularly when it comes to Saudi Arabia. He's been a leader on challenging the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia, and particularly as it pertains to Yemen, which of course is like one of the greatest humanitarian and moral crises of our time. And his leadership on that has obviously led to some significant progress on something that has been fairly intractable. Whether that gains any steam, within the West Wing in the Pentagon, we'll see. But at least on Capitol Hill, he's been a very outspoken person on many of these issues.
The recent and historic vote by the Senate to withdraw from hostilities in Yemen would seem to vindicate Khanna and his leadership on the issue. Do you believe it will encourage other progressive Democrats to take stronger positions on foreign policy?
Well, I think the vote is certainly big. And I think it can be a blueprint for progressives and Democrats as a whole to unify on certain foreign policy matters. We'll see. I think it remains to be seen whether that translates to other issues or even a broader foreign policy doctrine. Yemen has been such a big issue because what's going on there is so horrific that it garners a lot of attention. And of course, it has had more significant attention in recent weeks because of the killing of the dissident journalists by Saudi Arabia. So that's kind of shown a light on Saudi Arabia's actions, other malign actions as well. So how that kind of unification translates to less sexy issues like, say, Iran or Somalia, or, again, a broader foreign policy doctrine, I think that remains to be seen.
Is there a political cost, Eric, with voters for taking progressive positions on national security?
I think historically that's been at least the belief, particularly in the wake of 9/11. The Democrats appear weak on foreign policy and national security, and have therefore ceded a lot of that responsibility to Republicans and some of the most hawkish people in Washington, people like John Bolton. Whether or not that's still the case, I don't know. Clearly, Trump gets enough of his base on board for a lot of his agenda just by invoking national security. So clearly there's some appetite for that still. At the same time, there's a lot of energy on the part of the American public, I think, just looking for more judiciousness with how we use our military, a greater focus on diplomacy. I think we're seeing that right now. Of course, I think the inverse to that question, if there's a political cost to taking on national security issues, I think there's also a political benefit to talking about domestic issues for Democrats. We saw that in the last election, where they clearly staked out strong positions against Trump on healthcare, where they talked about immigration in a way that was obviously notably different from Trump. I think there's domestic issues that they feel like they can win on, and I think that might be part of why talking about foreign policy hasn't been as much of a priority for them.
Moving forward, what would you like to hear from progressive legislators on these issues?
Well, I think first and foremost, on a practical level, obviously, I think we need to reaffirm our commitments to international partnerships and institutions. The Trump administration has been extremely hostile to the United Nations, for instance. Has obviously had some high-profile attacks on our allies, whether it's Canada, whether it's France, whether it's Germany. And I think clearly reaffirming those partnerships is vital, because right now we're very isolated in our foreign policy in a way that I think is dangerous. Another thing is we need to talk about how we can fix some of those partnerships and how we can fix those international institutions, because they're not beyond reproach and they're not without their issues. I think there's ways to reaffirm our commitments to those things without eliminating them entirely, as Trump and his administration has seemed to want to do. More broadly, I think we clearly need more conversation on these things. I think these are conversations that Democrats need to have in public, and I think conversations that progressives need to have in public, and with a lot more specificity than we've seen. I think we've seen the broad strokes, and I think it would be great to see how, in a detailed way, we can differentiate ourselves from what Trump has put forth.
Okay. Eric Lutz, you can find articles of Eric's in many different publications, The Guardian, The Progressive, Mike, and The New Republic. Eric joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Eric, thank you for your time with us today. We do appreciate it. And, of course, we'd love to hear back from you again soon.
Thank you for having me on.
You're quite welcome. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with Politico's healthcare reporter Alice Ollstein about the Affordable Health Care Act after the latest judicial ruling and the political agenda behind it.
Joining us now from Politico, Alice Ollstein covers healthcare issues, and boy, a lot to talk about on that front these days. Alice, it's nice to see you.
Thanks
so much. Thanks for coming in. We've been storming away here through the headlines of the day for the last hour and a half, with comments pummeling us from all different directions, Peter?
Yes, indeed. We're on Twitter at BP Show. At BP Show. You were just talking with Rebecca Lieber about Ryan Zinke. Raymond says Ryan Zinke will be leaving Washington being dragged by his horse, not riding out on his horse, Bill.
Yeah, right.
You talked about Sherrod Brown with John Allen. Holly Tooker says Sherrod Brown is needed in a blue Senate. Electing him to as president means there could be a Republican senator in Ohio. Just putting that out there.
I know that's always people raise that argument sometimes, often about anybody moving up or leaving. But sometimes, in the greater good, he could do more good in the White House than he can in the Senate.
Yeah, for sure. Also, we were talking about the story of Goldstein, this military member that Donald Trump wants to help.
Yeah,
get him out of
Former
trouble.
Green Beret.
Techie says that Goldstein actually applied for a job in the CIA, and that is how the incident has resurfaced. We were wondering where this came from.
Okay, yeah.
That's part of the story, which is interesting, to say the least.
It is. It's still a very troubling story.
Yeah, yeah. If you have a comment on any topic at any time, just find us on Twitter at BP Show.
Right. Agree or disagree. We love hearing from you on Twitter at BP Show. Yes. So, Alice, this decision about the ACA, what is the current status, first of all, of the ACA? Is it still in effect or not?
Yes, even the Trump administration has confirmed that it is still in effect. What the judge says is it will become unconstitutional on January 1st when the mandate penalty goes away. That will render everything else unconstitutional, and states can then decide not to enforce it. So what the blue states defending the law are trying to do, and what they started filing in court last night, is to be able to appeal this and ask the judge either stay your ruling pending the appeal, and the appeal could take months, years potentially to work its way through the courts, or clarify that you don't mean this to go into effect right away. So either let us appeal it and stay till we can appeal it, or clarify that you don't mean this to go into effect right away.
Now, you say that the mandate goes away effective January 1.
Right.
By
the mandate penalty.
Penalty.
Starting next year.
By executive order, right?
No, by Congress.
Congress did pass that. Okay.
Congress passed that as part of the
tax bill, right?
Exactly. And so the irony here is that the judge is saying that Congress never intended the law to survive without the mandate. And I was running around the Senate last night asking Republican lawmakers, did you intend for the whole Affordable Care Act to be struck down when you voted to get rid of the mandate? And they said, no, we didn't. We were just trying to get rid of the mandate because people didn't like the mandate.
So who's this judge?
Very conservative judge at a district court in Texas. And I think what the focus should be on now is the Fifth Circuit, where this is likely headed.
On appeal.
On appeal. So the Fifth Circuit was already pretty conservative, but there are 5 newly installed Trump-appointed judges there out of 16, and there's 1 vacancy still. So, I mean...
just so everybody understands, who brought this lawsuit? Who are the parties in this lawsuit?
Republican attorneys general.
20, including Wisconsin.
Yes.
Right.
Although now Wisconsin wants to get out of it because they elected a Democratic attorney general. But these power-grabby bills that Scott Walker just signed on his way out the door may make that challenging. So whether or not Wisconsin can drop the lawsuit.
All right.
But
so
regardless.
After passage of the Affordable Care Act, just want to make sure everyone understands, then these are attorney generals from red states who where they were hoping Congress would repeal the Affordable Care Act. When they didn't, they decided to go this way and challenge the act itself, right? But the individual mandate. But also, is this the same suit that challenges the protections for pre-existing conditions?
Yes. So the Republican states who brought the case, they're arguing that because of the individual mandates repeal, the entire law with all of its protections, pre-existing conditions, Medicaid expansion, staying on your parents' plan until you're 26, drug price help for seniors on Medicare, all of it has to go. The Trump administration instead of defending a federal law, which is what the Justice Department normally does, decided to side with the states attacking the law. In part, they said, you don't have to get rid of the entire law. You just have to get rid of the protections for pre-existing conditions and some of those consumer protections. The reason for that is Obamacare was supposed to be this package deal for insurers. It was saying, we're going to force you to take everyone, no matter how sick they are and expensive they are to care for. But in order to make it not completely unaffordable for you, the insurers, we're going to have this mandate that encourages and pressures healthy people and young people to sign up too. That way you have a healthy mix in your risk pool and all the costs are shared between people. And so it was supposed to be a package deal. Congress did get rid of one key piece of it, but we've seen the rest of the law survive pretty well without that.
Right. I know it's maybe some people consider it a waste of time, but I think it's worth just taking a pause here to point out that this whole concept of keeping the insurance companies in the game, so not a single payer approach or anything or getting rid of them, keeping them in the game by putting some new requirements on them in terms of what they would cover and what they wouldn't, but also making everybody buy their insurance is a deal that was originally structured by the Heritage Foundation, the conservative think tank in Washington, D.C., as a private enterprise, private sector sort of approach.
Piloted by Romney Care.
And and picked up by Republican Governor Mitt Romney in Massachusetts, who put it into play. So this is a Republican free enterprise concept from the very beginning that once President Obama adopted it, then they turned against it because he liked that they had to dislike it or they had to try to cancel it. So I'm sure Donald Trump doesn't understand the history of it, but if you want the free enterprise approach to health care as opposed to the Bernie Sanders approach, it's Obamacare. They're idiots. They don't understand it. So they couldn't get it through Congress, the repeal, so now they go to the judge, and they finally found a judge somewhere in the country who was willing to go along with them. So people who may be sitting on the sidelines would, I think, legitimately raise the question, wait a minute, didn't the Supreme Court already decide this?
The Supreme Court upheld the Affordable Care Act twice now.
Well, then what the hell is this local judge doing going against the Supreme Court?
It's not going against the Supreme Court. This is a new line of argument that has to play out through the federal courts.
Yeah.
A lot of people think this is not going
and
any further than the Fifth Circuit, but I mean, we've seen stranger things. I don't think you can count anything out. I don't think you can count out this going all the way to the Supreme Court eventually.
It could, again.
But the Supreme Court still has the same folks that voted to uphold the Affordable Care Act before.
The five that did, right. Even though we now have Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh on the court, two new members on the court, that doesn't change the fact that the five who voted to uphold the individual mandate before and the entire Affordable Care Act were the four progressives and Justice John Roberts.
Right, exactly. And so... But that doesn't mean that, ho-hum, this means nothing. The timing of this ruling on the eve of the final day of open enrollment seemed almost designed to cause maximal chaos and confusion. The last day of open enrollment is the day when a lot of people sign up. Of course, everyone, psychologically just waits till the end. And it is one of the biggest enrollment days. And so to throw into doubt whether the law still exists is really...
Is open enrollment still underway?
It is in some states, but not the federal, not the healthcare.gov. That has closed.
Right.
That closed on Saturday.
What did we... the last time I saw the numbers were down this year. Again,
right.
Understandably, because they did no publicity about the fact that now's the time to sign up. You want to protect your family, you can sign up. Boom, boom, boom. Here's a deadline. They either eliminated that whole publicity campaign or severely cut the funding for it. Plus, with all the controversy about even before this judge's ruling,
right.
is the act going to survive or not? That some people turned away. So what do we know about enrollment levels, or do we know yet?
We're waiting for the final numbers. Those should come out tomorrow on Wednesday. So that's when we'll know what the final count is. And again, the last few days are really key. So up until last week, we saw that the numbers were a bit depressed. And I think that can be attributed to a lot of different things. Definitely the lack of federal outreach and advertising about open enrollment is a key factor. The Trump administration cut 90% of the budget for that. But I think also it just hasn't been in the news as much. When open enrollment began in November, it was the midterm elections and all the attention was on that. Now that we're at the end of open enrollment, all the attention is on, is there going to be a shutdown, and did Flynn get indicted, and all of this stuff. And so it just hasn't been the top story in the news. Last year, when the same cuts and changes from the Trump administration could have hurt open enrollment, it was a huge news story, and that really helped people be aware of it. So we'll see if maybe this judge's ruling has one of those effects where, yes, it could scare away some people, but it could also remind people that the Affordable Care Act is here and under threat, and maybe encourage folks to sign up.
And they have to renew every year, right, under Obamacare.
Although there is an auto renewal, so if you're on a plan and you want to keep it, you can get auto enrolled after the deadline. And so we'll see how many people that sweeps up as well. That's why it's important to wait for the final numbers.
Right.
And then in some states that are running their own exchanges and have longer deadlines and are pouring lots of money into outreach and encouraging people to sign up, they're seeing bigger numbers than before. So enrollment is actually up in those states.
What are those? I mean, we used to always talk about Kentucky as having kind of the model plan, which the new governor of Kentucky, I think, scuttled. So what are the states that have their best and the most active state plans now? Well, is California one?
Yeah, California does a lot, and New York, and some of these very big states with big populations. And so that could really sway the final numbers, which is why we're all waiting. And those numbers won't come out for several more weeks because they have a longer deadline than the rest of the country.
And California has already said, Attorney General Javier Becerra, as well as Governor Jerry Brown, that they're going to fight this latest judge's ruling because California really, first of all, it's a great system under HHS Secretary Diana Dooley out there. And there are millions and millions of people who are taking advantage of it either through Medicaid or through the state plan. And they could lose massive amounts of funding for California.
Absolutely.
If it's repealed.
Definitely. And I just can't emphasize enough. A lot of people think, oh, this won't affect me. I'm not, quote unquote, on Obamacare. And when people say that, they mean I'm not on the individual market or I'm not on Medicaid expansion. But almost everyone is on Obamacare in one form or another. It affects every part of our healthcare system. And to suddenly have that gutted out judicially would just cause maximum havoc.
How does it impact people? That's important for our listeners and viewers to know, I think. How will it impact you if you're not on Obamacare? Higher premiums, or
it could be so many things. It's a lot of behind the scenes things. Hospital payment rates, the fact that you can, on whatever private plan you're on, go get your annual preventative checkup, and that's free with no copay. Women getting contraception free with no copay.
Right.
Women not being charged more with their premiums just for being a woman. That's part of Obamacare. Just all of these things we
Chuck
take
Schumer mentioned
for granted.
Opioid, prescription drug prices, kind of across the board, right?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
yes. And so
what the hell are they doing by trying to get rid of this? And with a massive sweep like that, do they
causing a lot of panic? Because I think a lot of Republicans who cheered for so long the idea of repealing Obamacare. I can't tell you how many flacks and pundits I've heard refer to Republicans as the dog that caught the car. They've been chasing this car of Obamacare repeal for so long, and now a judge says, "Okay, here you go," and they don't know what to do about it. And running around Congress last night asking, does Congress need a backup plan, a contingency plan? And everyone's like, oh, no, this will just, go away in the courts. And so they're sort of counting on the courts to bail them out, the very courts that they've confirmed a lot of very conservative judges.
So let's go back to where you started with the judge's ruling is now being challenged by. So who are the people on the other side?
It's Becerra and the other Democratic attorneys
General. Okay.
So the House wants to join them next year when Democrats take over.
Yeah. Well, they have to wait a couple of weeks.
Sure, but they're going to do it.
And they will. Of course they will. But so they are starting right now to issue these requests to the judge for a stay or whatever.
Yes, they did last night.
How long before they're decided? And if not, then how long would it go to the Fifth Circuit?
It's up to the judge. The judge has set a meeting for early January to try to hash all of this out, but the blue states are asking for more clarity ahead of that because they want to make sure people know you can still enroll. This is not going anywhere. You still have your health care. It doesn't go away tomorrow. So they're asking the judge to, issue a clarifying statement.
Well, particularly because this other ruling, the Trump ruling on the fine, right, takes effect.
Which one?
January 1, that Trump, where you don't get fined for the mandate.
Yes.
And the judge's ruling itself takes effect January 1. So he's going to have to decide before the first of the year.
Exactly.
One would think, right? And then if he says, okay, it's appealed to the Fifth, I guess my point is that this appeal, as you point out, could take months, right?
Yes.
So if the judge
years.
Or years, right?
To go all the way to the Supreme Court, yes.
So this could be then the kind of deciding issue in 2020
Absolutely.
for Republicans.
And that's already a big fear. I mean,
fear on their part.
Oh, yes,
this
of
is
course.
the last thing they want to have to deal with.
Exactly. If the final say and the final boom falling and people losing their health care, tens of millions of people losing their health insurance.
Comes right in the middle of 2020.
Right in the middle
and
of
there's
President
no way
Trump's
they could blame this
campaign.
on Democrats. I mean, well, they may try. I want to be careful there.
Try.
Of course, they'll try. But I mean, it would be
But
difficult.
we know who brought the
lawsuit. It will be difficult when we know who brought the lawsuit and who has been preaching repeal of Obamacare since Obamacare was first proposed.
Right. And I think that's why the House swiftly voting to intervene in the lawsuit and argue in defense of Obamacare is both politically important and practically important. It's politically important because then Democrats can concretely point and say, look, we're fighting to protect your health care, your pre-existing conditions, et cetera. It's practically important because the judge's reasoning hinges on what was Congress's intent. Did Congress intend the whole law to fall with the fall of the individual mandate? And the House counsel can go argue, no, we did not. We debated repealing the entire Affordable Care Act many, many times, and we never got it done.
Right.
We chose not to do it.
I just want to say in the headline of the New York Times this morning, one analysis here is the headline is Republicans may regret new ruling on CARE Act. Right? Just as you've been pointing out, right? Another headline, states ask federal judge to continue the health law.
Yes.
Which is what you were just reporting on. And I was looking for the headline. I didn't see it here. But meanwhile, Donald Trump is telling everybody we're gonna have this is not a problem because we're gonna have a beautiful new health care plan.
And a couple.
What the hell is he talking about? Does he have any idea? Do they have a plan?
Well, no, they do not have a plan. And the Trump administration, before the ruling came out, said we have a contingency plan for this court case. And they
who said that?
Seema Verma, the CMS administrator, told reporters, don't worry, we have a contingency plan. The ruling has come down. People have been asking, what is it? And we're not hearing one. And we have sources saying there really isn't one. And they weren't anticipating this sweeping a ruling. They were anticipating maybe a ruling striking down a piece of Obamacare, but not the entire law.
It was just the other night at the congressional ball that Donald Trump was talking about this. But I remember back in 2016 in his campaign, he kept saying, we're going to repeal Obamacare. We're going to replace it with something beautiful. Right?
Well, that's what Congress said for many. I mean, the Republican House said that for many years prior to that. And just for all of that time and all of the time since, there's been no single replacement plan that they've been able to agree on. They only agree on repeal.
Right.
There's a lot of competing ideas of how to replace, but none that could ever muster the votes.
You mentioned that the White House has intervened on behalf of the attorneys general. Has Congress?
No, which is what the Democratic House wants to do next year. And Schumer wants to do it in the Senate, but they won't have the votes.
But meanwhile, among Republicans,
right,
with control of the House and the Senate, they haven't been part of this lawsuit?
No, they have not. And they are opposed in the Senate to going along with Schumer's call for a vote to intervene to defend the ACA.
Isn't one of the things that we're learning as part of this, first of all, that healthcare, I think Republicans may have learned the hard way, that healthcare is a pretty popular issue, isn't it? I mean, for people, it gets right down to it, that we all live sort of one health crisis away from bankruptcy, right? And it could happen to you, to your kid, to your spouse, whatever. And people recognize it doesn't matter whether you're a Democrat or Republican. That's a real legitimate fear. We've seen it happen to so many people. So that healthcare in itself, having that protection for your family, is something people now, I think, have come to expect, right? Or maybe and accept that the government has some role in making that and helping that us realize that goal.
Definitely. And I think the polling on that is clear. And I think that's evident in the most recent election. Democrats lost several election cycles over voter anger over Obamacare's passage. But now that all the provisions are in effect and people are experiencing the benefits, it's just really swung the other way. And people just don't like change. I mean, they punished Democrats in 2010 for massively changing the healthcare system, and they punished Republicans in 2018 for trying to change it back. They don't like change, and so they really aren't going to like this lawsuit if it goes anywhere.
It is ironic that what was the number one issue helping Republicans may now have become the number one issue hurting them. And I was started to ask, is something else that we've learned is that with these government programs, so criticized in the beginning, starting with Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, socialized medicine, whatever they called them in the beginning. But once they're in place and people start to benefit from the protections that they provide, it's awfully hard to get rid of them.
Definitely. And of course, there's always trade-offs. And there have been people who've experienced big price increases, mostly the unsubsidized people in the individual market. They've really been hammered. And so it's not all positive and no downsides. Nothing ever is. But like you said, all of these people who were not able to have insurance before this, people with pre-existing conditions in the private market, for instance, people who made too much for traditional Medicaid, but were still very poor and couldn't afford even the cheapest plan in states with Medicaid expansion, they've been able to get covered. So, yes, people across the country are very anxious about the impact of this ruling.
Yeah, well, we're going to know very soon what this judge does and then where it goes from here. Meanwhile, don't panic. Everything is still in place, at least for now. Alice Ollstein from Politico, Politico.com. Thanks so much, Alice, for coming in.
That's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Adam Green, Eric Lutz, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.